13. Struck through text. The Minotaur. Note 123. Previously read. End struck through text. Alarga en la pradera una pausada sombra, pero ya el hecho de nombrarlo y de conjecturar su circunstancia lo hace ficción del arte y no criatura viviente de las que andan por la tierra. Jorge Luis Borges. Note 255. A slow shadow spreads across the prairie, but still the act of naming it, of guessing what is its nature and its circumstances, creates a fiction, not a living creature, not one of those who wander on the earth. As translated by Alistair Reid. Editors. End note 255. The Weight. Teppit C. Brooks had seen plenty of children's drawings in her life. Having taught all grades from kindergarten through 6th grade, she was familiar with a vast array of stick figures, objects, and plots. This was not the first time she had seen a wolf, a tiger, or a dragon. The problem was that these wolves did not just stalk quietly through cadmium woods. Their teeth drew madder and rose from each other's throats. The tigers did not just sleep on clover. They clawed Sunday red and indigo from Kelladon hills. And the dragon, with its terrible emerald tail and ruby glare, did not merely threaten. It incinerated everything around it with a happy blossom of heliotrope and gamboge. And yet even these violent fantasies were nothing compared to what lay in wait at the center of the drawing. The week before Navidson set out on the rescue attempt, Brooks asked her 3rd grade class to draw a picture of their house. The one Chad handed in had no chimney, windows, or even a door. In fact, it was nothing more than a black square filling 90% of the page. Furthermore, several layers of black crayon and pencil had been applied so that not even a speck of the paper beneath could show through. In the thin margins, Chad had added the marauding creatures. It was an extremely odd image and stuck with Brooks. She knew Chad had recently moved to Virginia and had already been involved in several scuffles in the school playground. Though she was hardly satisfied with her conclusion, she decided the picture reflected the stress caused by the move and the new surroundings. But she also made a note to keep an eye on him as the year progressed. She would not have to wait that long. Brooks usually went straight home after school, but that Friday, quite by chance, she wandered into the kindergarten classroom. A number of drawings hung on the wall. One in particular caught her eye. The same wolves, the same tigers, the same dragon, and at the center, though this time only 2/3 the size of the page, an impenetrable square composed of several layers of black and cobalt blue crayon, with not even the slightest speck of white showing through. That picture had been drawn by Daisy. Though Brooks lacked a formal degree in psychology, 2 decades of teaching, nearly half of it at Sawacha Elementary, had exposed her to enough child abuse to last a lifetime. She was familiar with the signs, and not just the obvious ones like malnutrition, abrasion, or unnatural shyness. She had learned to read behavior patterns, eating habits, and even drawings. That said, she still had never encountered such a striking similarity between a 5-year-old girl and her 8-year-old brother. The collective artistry was appalling. Now heck, I've survived 2 bad marriages and seen my share of evil along the way. I don't get fazed by much, but let me tell you, just seeing those pictures gave me the willies. Note 256, Teppit C. Brooks's The Places I've Seen, as told to Emily Lucy Gates, San Francisco, Russian Hill Press, 1996, pages 37 to 69. End note 256. Teppit C. Brooks could have contacted the Department of Children's Services. She could have even called the Navidsons and requested a consultation. That Monday, however, when neither Chad nor Daisy showed up at school, she decided to pay the Navidsons a little visit herself. Willies or not, curiosity got the best of her. Truth be told, I just had to take a gander at the place that had inspired those drawings. Note 257, Ibid, page 38. Note 258. Also refer back to footnote 212 dealing with Françoise Minkowska, and note 258, and note 257. During her lunch break, Brooks climbed into her Ford Bronco and made the 50-minute drive to Ash Tree Lane. I thought the house was nice and quaint on the outside. I was expecting something else, I guess. To tell you the truth, I almost drove off, but since I'd made the drive, I decided I should at least introduce myself. I had a good excuse. I wanted to know why both kids were not in school. And heck, if it was chickenpox, I've had mine, so that was no matter. Note 259, Tebbit C. Brooks's The Places I've Seen, page 142, end note 259. Brooks recalls looking at her watch as she walked toward the front door. It was close to 1. I knocked or rang the doorbell. I don't remember. Then I heard the screams, wails. I've heard that kind of grief before. I started banging real hard. A second later, an Afro-American man in a wheelchair opened the door. He seemed surprised to see me, like he was expecting someone else. I could tell he was in pretty bad shape, his hands all ripped up and bleeding. I didn't know what to say, so I told him I was from the school. He just nodded and told me he was waiting for the ambulance, and would I mind giving him a hand. Brooks was hardly prepared for the slaughterhouse she was about to enter. A woman sobbing in the living room, a big man holding her. 2 bodies in the kitchen surrounded by blood. And on the staircase, Chad sitting next to his little sister Daisy, who kept quietly singing to no one in particular, words no one else could understand. Ba, da, ba, ba. Brooks lasted 5 minutes, crossing herself too many times to help anyone. Fortunately, the sheriff, the paramedics, and an ambulance soon arrived. I had entered a war zone, and I have to be honest, it overwhelmed me. I could tell my blood pressure was rising. You know, sometimes you go into something thinking you're going to make all the difference. You're going to save the situation, make it right. But that was too much for me. It was real humbling. Starts to cry. I never saw the kids after that, though I still have their drawings. Note 260, The Navidson Legacy. Winter's Grave, PBS, September 8th, 1996. End note 260. In some respects, the distillate of crayon and color traced out by the hands of 2 children captures the awfulness at the heart of that house better than anything caught on film or tape. Those shallow lines and imperfect shapes narrating the light seeping away from their lives. Brooks, however, is not the only one to have seen those drawings. Chad and Daisy's room is full of them, the monstrous black square getting progressively larger and darker until, in Chad's case, not even the barest margin survives. Karen knows her kids are in trouble. A clip of High 8 catches her, telling them that as soon as their father returns, she will take them all to Grandma's. Unfortunately, when Navidson, Tom, and Reston disappear down that hallway early Saturday morning, Karen is put in an impossible situation, torn between monitoring the radios and looking after Chad and Daisy. In the end, separation from Navidson proves more painful. Karen keeps by the radios. For a while, Daisy and Chad try to coax their mother to even briefly abandon her post. When that fails, they hang around the living room. Karen's inability to concentrate on them, however, soon drives both children away. A few times, Karen asks them to at least keep together. Daisy, however, insists on hiding in her room where she can play endlessly with her prized Spanish doll and the dollhouse Tom finally finished for her, while Chad prefers to escape outside, disappearing into the summoning woods, sometimes with Hillary, often now without, always well beyond the range of any camera, his adventures and anger passing away unobserved. That Saturday night, Chad and Daisy have to put themselves to sleep. Then, around 10 o'clock, we watch as both children come racing down into the living room, claiming to have heard voices. Karen, however, has heard nothing more than the ever-present hiss of the radios, occasionally interrupted by Tom calling in from the great hall. Even after she checks out their bedroom, she is unable to detect any unusual sounds. At least Chad and Daisy's obvious fear momentarily snaps Karen out of her obsession. She leaves the radios and spends an hour tucking her children into bed. Dr. Lon Lu believes the house enabled Karen to slowly break down her reliance on Navidson, allowing her a greater and more permanent distance. Her children's fear, coupled with their need for her, further separated Karen from Navidson. Sadly, it's not the healthiest way to proceed. She merely replaced one dependency for another without confronting what lay at the heart of both. Note 261, Dr. Lon Lu's Adding In to Dependent, Psychology Today, Volume 27, March-April 1994, page 32, Endnote 261. Then, on Sunday evening, both children asked her what happened to all her feng shui objects. We watch as they lead her from room to room, pointing out the absent tiger, the absent marble horses, and even the absent vase. Karen is shocked. In the kitchen, she has to sit down, on the verge of a panic attack. Her breathing has quickened, her face is covered in sweat. Fortunately, the episode only lasts a couple of minutes. Along with several other critics, Gail Colt dwells on Karen's choice of words during her conversation with Tom on the radio when she refers to feng shui as some such shit. Karen has begun to deconstruct her various mechanisms of denial. She does not continue to insist on the ineffectual science of feng shui. She recognizes that the key to her misery lies in the still unexplored fissure between herself and Navidson. Without knowing it, she has already begun her slow turn to face the meaning, or at least one meaning, of the darkness dwelling in the depths of her house. Note 262, Gail Kaltz, The Loss of Faith, Thank God. Grand Street, Volume 54, Fall, 1195, page 118. Endnote 262. Certainly, Karen's step away from denial is made more evident when, right after a talk with Tom, she gathers up any remaining items having to do with feng shui and throws them in a box. David N. Breyer, in his thesis House Cleaning, notes how Karen not only adds to this collection the books already mentioned in Chapter 5, but also includes the Bible, several New Age manuals, her tarot cards, and, strangest of all, a small hand mirror. Note 263, David N. Breyer's House Cleaning. Dissertation, University of Tennessee, 1996, page 104, Endnote 263. Then, after depositing the box in the garage, she looks in on her children one more time, comforting them with an open invitation to sleep in the living room with her if they like. They do not join her, but the grateful tone of their murmurs seems to suggest they will now sleep better. Helen Agleway asserts that by Monday, October the 8th, Karen has made up her mind to depart. When Tom reappears in the living room and informs her that Navidson is only hours away from getting back, she keeps the children home from school because she has every intention of leaving for New York that day. Note 264, Helen Agleway's The Process of Leaving, Dissertation, Indiana University, 1995, page 241. Endnote 264. Upon returning from town with bundles of rope, the pulleys, and several trolley wheels, Karen begins packing and orders the children to try to do the same. She is in fact in the middle of frantically removing several winter coats and shoes from the foyer closet when Tom races out of the hallway, pushing the gurney in front of him, tears gushing from his eyes. When Karen sees wax, her hand flies to her mouth, though it hardly prevents the cry. Note 265. Many have complained that the hallway tape, as well as the two untitled sequences frequently identified as The Wait and The Evacuation, are incomprehensible. Poor resolution, focus, and sound, with the exception of the interview shot afterward in 16mm, further exacerbate the difficulties posed by so many jarring cuts and a general chronological jumble. That said, it is crucial to recognize how poor quality and general incoherence is not a reflection of the creator's state of mind. Quite the contrary, Navidson brilliantly used these stylistic discrepancies to further drive home the overwhelming horror and dislocation experienced by his family during the evacuation. For other books devoted specifically to reconstructing the narrative, see The Navidson Record, The Novelization, Los Angeles, Goal Gotham Publication, 1994, Thornton J. Cannon Jr.'s The Navidson Record, Action and Chronologies, Portland, Pennybrook Press, 1996, and Esther Hartline's Through Lines, New York, Dutton, 1995. Endnote 265. Reston emerges from the hallway next, the growl growing louder behind him, threatening to follow him into the living room. Frantically, he slams the door and bolts all 4 locks, which, no doubt thanks to the door's acoustic rating, actually seems to keep that terrible sound at bay. Karen, however, starts shouting, "What are you doing, Billy? What about Navy? Where's Navy?" Even though he is still crying, Tom tries to pull her away from the door. "We lost him." "He's dead?" Karen's voice cracks. "I don't think so," Tom shakes his head. "But he's still down there, way down." "Well, then go in and get him. Go in and get your brother." Then, starting to shriek, "You can't just leave him there." But Tom remains motionless, and when Karen finally looks him in the face and beholds the measure of his fear and grief, she crumples into a fit of sobs. Reston goes to the foyer and calls an ambulance. Meanwhile, Wax, who has been temporarily left alone in the kitchen, quietly groans on the stretcher. Next to him lies Jed's body. Unfortunately, Tom did not realize how much blood had soaked into Jed's clothes. Blind with his own sorrow, he unknowingly covered the linoleum with a smear of red when he set the corpse down. He even stepped in the blood and tracked footprints across the carpet as he lurched back to the living room to console Karen. Perhaps, inevitably, all the commotion draws the children out of their room. Chad catches sight of the body first. There is something particularly disquieting about watching the way he and Daisy walk slowly toward Jed and then over to Wax's side. They both seem so removed, almost in a daze. "Where's our daddy?" Chad finally asks, but Wax is delirious. "What? I need water." Together, Chad and Daisy fill a glass from the sink. Wax, however, is far too weak to sit up, let alone drink. They end up dribbling small drops of water on his cracked lips. A few seconds later, there is a loud banging on the front door. Reston wheels over and opens it. He expects to see the paramedics, but finds instead a woman in her late 40s with almost perfectly grey hair. Chad and Daisy retreat to the staircase. They too step in the blood, their feet leaving small red imprints on the floor. Chad's teacher fails to utter even one word or offer any sort of assistance. Tom continues to sit with Karen until eventually her muted cries join the wail of sirens rapidly approaching their house on Ash Tree Lane. While the Navidson record clearly states that Wax Hook survived, it does not dwell on any of the details following his departure. Numerous articles published after the film's release, however, reveal that he was almost immediately rushed by helicopter to a hospital in Washington, D.C., where he was placed in an ICU. There, doctors discovered that fragments from the coracoid process and scapular spine had turned his trapezius, delta, and infraspinous muscles to hamburger. Miraculously, though, the bullet and bone shrapnel had only grazed the subclavian artery. Wax eventually recovered, and after a long period of rehabilitation, returned to a life of outdoor activities, even though it is doubtful he will ever climb Everest now, let alone attempt to solo the North Face. By his own admission, Wax also keeps clear of caves, not to mention his own closet. Note 266, see U.S. News and World Report, Volume 121, December 30th, 1996, page 84. Premiere, Volume 6, May 1993, pages 68 to 70. Life, Volume 17, July 1994, pages 26 to 32. Climbing, November 1st, 1995, page 44. Details, December 1995, page 118. End note, 266. Even as Wax was loaded into the ambulance, police began an investigation into Jed Leader's death. Reston provided them with a copy of the tape from his high eight showing Holloway shooting Wax and Jed. To the police, the murder appeared to have taken place in nothing more than a dark hallway. As APBs went out, patrolmen began a statewide search, which would ultimately last several weeks. That afternoon, Karen also insisted on introducing the authorities to that all-consuming ash-walled maze. Perhaps she thought they would attempt to locate Navidson. The results were hardly satisfying. In the Reston interview, Billy shakes his head and even laughs softly. It wasn't a bad idea. Tom and I had had enough too. Karen just expected too much, especially from a town that has one sheriff and a handful of deputies. When the sheriff came over, Karen immediately dragged him over to the hallway, handed him a flashlight and the end of a spool of Monel fishing line. He looked at her like she was nuts, but then I think he got a little spooked too. At that point in time, no one was about to go in there with him. Karen, because of her claustrophobia. Tom, well, he was already going to the bottom of a bottle. And me, I was trying to fix my wheelchair. It was all bent from when I came up on the pulley. Even so, though, even if my chair had been fine, going back would have been hard. Anyway, Sheriff Oxy, Axnard, I think that was his name. Sheriff Axnard went in there by himself. He walked 10 feet in and then walked straight back out, thanked us and left. He never said a word about where he'd been, and he never came back. He spent a good amount of time looking for Holloway everywhere else, but never in the house. Right after the release of the Navidson record, Sheriff Josiah Axnard was accosted by numerous reporters. One clip captures the sheriff in the process of climbing into his squad car. For once and for all, that house was completely searched, and Holloway Roberts was not in it. 6 months later, the sheriff consented to an interview on National Public Radio, April 18th, 1994, where he told a slightly different story. He confessed to walking down an unfamiliar hallway. "It's not there no more," he continued. "I checked. Nothing unusual there now, but back then there was a corridor on the south wall. Cold. No lights and going on into nowhere. It creeped me like I'd never been creeped before. Like I was standing in a gigantic grave. And I remember then, clearly, like it was yesterday, thinking to myself, if Holloway's in there, I don't need to worry. He's gone. He's long gone." Note 267. Nor is that the first time the word grave appears in reference to the house in the Navidson record. When Reston suggests Navidson use the Leica distance meter, he adds, "That should put this ghost in the grave fast." Holloway, in exploration number 3, mutters, "Cold as a grave." Also in the same segment, Wax grunts a variation, "I feel like I'm in a coffin." In one of her high 8 journal entries, Karen tries to make light of her situation when she remarks, "It's like having a giant catacomb for a family room." Tom, in Tom's story, tells the grave maker joke, while Reston, during the rescue attempt, admits to Navidson, "You know, I feel like I'm in a grave." To which Navidson responds, "Makes you wonder what gets buried here." "Well, judging by the size," Reston replies, "it must be the giant from Jack and the fucking Beanstalk." Giant, indeed. Note 268. On several occasions, Zampano also uses the word grave. Note 269. See index. Editors. End notes 267 to 269. That night, Karen stays in the living room, crying off and on, leaving the hallway door open, even though, as she explains to Reston, standing a foot too close will cause her to experience heart palpitations and tremors. Reston, however, badly in need of some shut-eye, almost immediately falls into a deep sleep on the couch. There is one particularly horrible moment when the phone rings and Karen answers on speaker. It is Jed Leader's fiancé calling from Seattle, still unaware of what has happened. At first, Karen tries to keep the news to herself, but when the woman begins to detect the lie, Karen tells her the truth. A panicked shout cracks over the speakerphone and then decays into terrified cries. Abruptly, the line goes dead. Karen waits for the woman to call back, but the phone does not ring again. Of course, during all this, the children are once again abandoned, left to look after each other, with no one around to help translate the horror of the afternoon. They hide in their room, rarely saying a thing. Not even Tom makes an appearance to even temporarily contest their fears with the soothing lyric of a bedtime story about otters, eagles, and the occasional tiger. When Tom had returned from the grave, he was convinced he had lost his brother. Both he and Reston had heard the great spiral staircase yawn beneath them, and Reston's high eight had even caught a glimpse of Navidson's light sinking, finally vanishing into the deep like a failing star. As Billy explains in the Reston interview, Tom felt like a part of him had been ripped away. I'd never seen him act like that. He started shaking, and tears just kept welling up in his eyes. I tried to tell him the stairway could shrink just like it had stretched, and he kept agreeing with me and nodding, but that didn't stop the tears. It was terrifying to watch. He loved his brother that much. After watching the paramedics take Wax away, we follow Tom's retreat to the study, where he manages to locate among his things the last bit of a joint. Smoking it, however, offers absolutely no relief. He is no longer crying, but his hands still shake. He takes several deep breaths, and then, as Karen is getting ready to show Sheriff Axnar the hallway, he steals a sip of bourbon. Note 270, see Harmon Frisch's Not Even Bill's Acquaintance. 20 years in the program, ed. Cynthia Huxley, New York, W. W. Norton and Company, 1996, pages 143 to 179, endnote 270. Regrettably, Tom fails to stop at a sip. A few hours later, he has finished off the whole fifth, as well as half a bottle of wine. He might have spent all night drinking had exhaustion not caught up with me. Of course, the following morning does nothing to erase yesterday's events. Tom attempts to recover lost ground by accompanying Reston back to the Great Hall. Much to their surprise, however, they discover the hallway now terminates 30 feet in, nor are there any doors or alternate hallways branching off it. Karen returns to her room when she sees Tom and Reston reappear only 5 minutes later. Even though he too is suffering from Navidson's disappearance, Reston still does his best to counsel Tom, and at least for a few hours Tom successfully resists drinking anything more. Chad apparently had escaped from the house at dawn and now refuses to come in or say a word to his mother. Tom eventually finds him among the branches of a tree just past the edge of the property line. Nevertheless, no amount of coaxing will induce the 8-year-old to come back in. In Billy's words, the Reston interview again, Tom told me Chad was happy in his tree, and Tom was hard-pressed to start telling him inside was a better place. However, there was something else. The kid apparently bolted from the house when he heard some kind of murmuring, something about a walker in darkness. Then a bang, like a gunshot, and the sound of a man dying. Woke him right up, he said. Back then, I assumed he'd just been dreaming. Judging from the house footage, what seems to really push Tom over the edge that second day is when he re-enters the house and finds Daisy, her forearms a-crawl with strange scratches, swaying in front of the hallway screaming, "Daddy!" despite the absence of a reply, the absence of even an echo. When Karen finally comes downstairs and carries her daughter outside to help her find Chad, Tom takes the car and goes into town. An hour later he returns with groceries, unnecessary medical supplies, magazines, and the reason for the excursion in the first place, a case of bourbon. On the third and fourth day, Tom does not emerge once from the study, attempting to drink his grief into submission. Karen, on the other hand, begins to deal with the consequences of Navidson's disappearance. She rapidly starts paying more attention to her children, finally luring Chad back into the house where she can oversee his and Daisy's packing efforts. In a brief clip, we catch Karen on the phone, presumably with her mother, discussing their imminent departure from Virginia. Reston remains in the living room, frequently attempting to raise Navidson on the radio, though never hearing more than static and white noise. Outside, a thunderstorm begins to crack and spit rain at the windows. Lightning builds shadows. A wind howls like the wounded, filling everyone with cold, bone-weary dread. Toward midnight, Tom emerges from the study, steals a slice of lemon meringue pie, and then whips up some hot chocolate for everyone. Whole milk, unsweetened cocoa, sugar, and a splash of vanilla extract, all brought to a careful simmer. Billy and Karen appreciate the gesture. Tom has not stopped drinking, and even doses his cup with a shot of Jack Daniels, but he does seem to have leveled out, not exactly achieving some sublime moment of clarity, but at least attaining a certain degree of self-control. Then Tom, though he is only wearing a t-shirt, takes a deep breath and marches into the hallway again. A minute later he returns. "It's no more than 10 feet deep now," Tom grunts. "And Navy's been gone over 4 days." "There's still a chance," Reston grumbles. Tom tries to shrug off the certitude that his brother is dead. "You know," he continues very quietly, still staring at the hallway, "there once was this guy who went to Madrid. He was in the mood for something new, so he decided to try out this small restaurant and order, sight unseen, the house specialty. Soon a plate arrived loaded with rice pilaf and 2 large meaty objects. 'What's this?' he asked his waiter. 'Cojones, senor.' 'What are cojones?' 'Cojones,' the waiter answered, 'are the testicles of the bull that lost in the arena today.' Though a little hesitant at first, the man still went ahead and tried them. Sure enough, they were delicious. Well, a week later, he goes back to the same restaurant and orders the same thing. This time, when his dish arrives, the meaty objects are much smaller and don't taste nearly as good. He immediately calls the waiter over. 'Hey,' he says, 'what are these?' 'Cojones,' the waiter replies. 'No,' he explains, 'I had them last week and they were much bigger.' 'Ah, senor,' the waiter sighs, 'the bull does not lose every time.'" Tom's joke attempts to deflect some of the pain inherent in his protracted wait, but of course nothing can really diminish the growing knowledge that Navidson may have vanished for good. Tom eventually returns to the study to try and sleep, but Karen remains in the living room, occasionally dozing off, often trying to reach Navidson on the radios, whispering his name like a lullaby or a prayer. Note 271. Karen's emotional response is not limited to longing. Earlier that evening, she retreated to the bathroom, ran the water in the sink, and recorded this somewhat accusatory High 8 journal entry. "Damn you for going, Navy. Damn you." Starting to cry. "This house, this home, was supposed to help us get closer. It was supposed to be better and stronger than some stupid marriage vow. It was supposed to make us a family." Sobbing. "But, oh my God, look what's happened." End note 271. In the 5:09 a.m. High 8 clip, Karen rests her head on her hands and starts to sleep. There is something eerie about the odd stillness that settles on the living room then, not even remotely affected by Reston's snoring on the couch. It is as if this scene has been impossibly fixed and will never change again, until, out of the blue, presumably before the cameras can shut off, no longer ordered to run by the motion detectors, Navidson limps out of the hallway. He is clearly exhausted, dehydrated, and perhaps a little unable to believe he has actually escaped the maze. Seeing Karen, he immediately kneels beside her, attempting to wake her with the gentlest word. Karen, however, drawn so abruptly from her dreams, cannot arrest the shocked gasp summoned by the sound and sight of Navidson. Of course, the moment she realizes he is not a ghost, her terror dissolves into a hug and a flood of words, awakening everyone in the house. Several essays have been written about this reunion, and yet not one of them suggests Karen has reverted to her former state of dependency. Consider Anita Massine's comments. Her initial embrace and happiness is not just about Navidson's return. Karen realizes she has fulfilled her end of the bargain. Her time in that place has come to an end. Navidson's arrival means she can leave. Note 272. Anita Massine's Dialects of Divorce in American Film in the 20th Century. Oxford, Ohio, Miami University Press, 1995, page 228. Endnote 272. Or Garrigan Thorndike Taylor's response. Where previously Karen might have dissolved into tears and her typical clutching, this time she is clearly more reserved, even terse, relying on her smile for defense. Note 273, Garrigan Thorndike Taylor's The Ballast of Self, Modern Psyche, Volume 18, 1996, page 74. Also refer back to Chapter 2 and 5. Endnote 273. Or finally, Professor Lyle McDonough. The reason Karen cries out when Navidson wakes her has nothing to do with the inherent terror of that hallway or some other cauchemar. It has only to do with Navidson. Deep down inside, she really does fear him. She fears he will try to keep her there. She fears he will threaten her, slowly forming independence. Only once the reins of consciousness slip into place does she resort to expected modes of welcome. Note 274. Professor Lyle McDonough's Dissolution of Love in the Navidson Record. Crafton Lecture Series, Chatfield College in St. Martin, Ohio, February 9th, 1996. Endnote 274. Karen clearly refuses to allow Navidson's appearance to alter her plans. She does not accept that merely his presence entitles him to authority. Her mind is made up. Even before he can begin to recount his desperate flight up those stairs, or how he found Holloway's equipment. Note 275. In the following excerpt from the last interview, Navidson sheds some more light on how he managed to emerge from those dark hollows. I remember I had found Jed's pack, so I knew I was okay on water and food for a while. Then I just started climbing up the stairs, one step at a time. At first it was slow going. That roar would frequently rise up the central shaft like some awful wail. At times it sounded like voices, hundreds of them, thousands, calling after me. And then other times it sounded like the wind, only there is no wind there. I remember finding the Holloway tape off one of the landings. I had caught sight of a few bits of neon marker still attached to the wall and wandered over to take a look. A minute later I saw his pack and the camera. It was all just sitting there. The rifle was nearby too, but there was no sign of him. That was pretty odd to come across something, let alone anything, in that place. But what made finding that stuff particularly strange was how much I'd been thinking of Holloway at the time. I kept expecting him to jump around some corner and shoot me. After that, I was a little spooked and made sure to chuck the ammo down into that pit off to my right. Over and over I kept wondering what happened to his body. It was making me crazy, so I tried fixing my mind on other things. I remember thinking then that one of the toenails on my right foot, the big toenail, had torn loose and started to bleed. That's when Deliel came into my head, which was awful. Finally, though, I began concentrating on Karen, on Chad and Daisy, on Tom and Billy. I thought about every time we'd gone to a movie together or a game or whatever, 10 years ago, 4 months ago, 20 years ago. I remembered when I first met Karen, the way she moved, those perfect angles she'd make with her wrists, her beautiful long fingers. I remembered when Chad was born, all that kind of stuff, trying to recall those moments as vividly as possible, in as much detail. Eventually I went into this daze and the hours began to melt away. Felt like minutes. On the third night I tried to take another step and found there wasn't one. I was in the Great Hall again. Oddly enough, though, as I soon found out, I was still a good ways from home. For some reason, everything had stretched there too. Now, all of a sudden, there were a lot of new dead ends. It took me another day and night to get back to the living room, and to tell you the truth, I was never sure I was going to make it, until I finally did. End note 275. Karen announces her intention to leave for New York City that night. Of course, by the time they had all sat down and watched the Holloway tape, Navidson was the only one who had second thoughts about abandoning the cold lure of those halls.